The morning Traverse City buried Eleanor Voss. The sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way. Not the soft gray of an overcast summer, but the dense, pressurized gray of something gathering itself. The kind of sky that made the old timers on Front Street stop their conversations mid sentence and look up, then say nothing, because the sky was saying it for them. Clara Voss did not look up. She walked the 2 miles from Doan's General Store, in her work apron still carrying the smell of flour dust and iron nails, because no one had thought to send word before the morning rush. She had found out from a customer. Mrs. Halverson, picking up lamp oil, had touched Clara's arm with that particular softness people reserve for delivering news they are relieved is not theirs to carry. The walk home had taken 23 minutes. Clara counted her steps the entire way because counting was the only thing that kept the road from tilting. By the time she reached the house, they had already begun. Ruth stood at the head of the kitchen table with a sheet of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand and the posture of a woman conducting an inventory rather than grieving a mother. 31 years old, spine like a railroad tie, hair pinned so tightly it pulled the skin at her temples smooth. She did not look up when Clara came through the door. She was reading from the list. May sat beside her 27 years old hands, folded in her lap, her soft eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, the way they always were when Ruth was speaking, present enough to nod, absent enough to survive. The house smelled like cold coffee and something else underneath it, something faintly medicinal, faintly sweet. The smell of a room where someone had recently stopped breathing. Clara stood in the doorway, still in her apron. She had not been allowed to see her mother's face yet. That was the thing she would remember longest, not the words that came next, not the paper on the table, but the fact that Eleanor Voss lay in the back room 30 feet away, and her youngest daughter had not yet been permitted to stand beside her. Ruth laid out the terms, the way a banker reads a deed, the house to herself, the 40 acres of river bottom farmland, to May the savings divided after funeral costs. Then she set down the pencil, looked at Clara for the first time, and did something Clara would spend years turning over in her memory. She softened her voice. Not from grief, not from guilt, from strategy. The way you soften a blade before you use it. Mama left you the cabin, the stone cabin, 4 miles north of town, on 4 acres of granite bedrock that hadn't produced a crop in living memory. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chimney drew wrong. The well sat a quarter-mile through dense birch, and the whole structure had been laughed at by everyone in Leelanau County for as long as Clara could remember. May made a small sound barely audible, the involuntary noise of a person suppressing a laugh they know is wrong. She covered her mouth with her hand, but the damage was already done. Clara did not respond to either of them. She looked at the deed on the table, a folded square of paper already creased where Ruth had pressed it flat with her palm. Then she looked at Ruth's hand, still flat against the table, still pressing down. And there, peeking from beneath the edge of Ruth's thumb, a corner of white paper folded separate from the deed tucked beneath that deliberate hand. Clara kept her face very still. She had grown up in this house. She had learned young that you gathered more truth from what was hidden than from what was offered. She picked up the deed. She folded it once. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked out without saying goodbye to either of her sisters, because goodbye implied she was leaving something behind worth naming. Cyrus Doan was waiting outside with his wagon hat in hand, that rehearsed expression of sympathy he kept near the door of his store, the way other men kept their good coats ready for occasions that called for the appearance of feeling. He was 50 years old, the kind of man who had built an empire, not by being the strongest in the room, but by being the one who knew the price of everything first. He helped Clara up onto the bench with a steadiness that felt less like kindness and more like the beginning of a transaction. They rode half a mile before he spoke. Terrible thing. Your mother was a good woman. Clara said nothing. Peculiar, but good. Still nothing. He let the silence stretch, then tried a different door. What did your sisters give you? Not what they took, what they gave, as though Ruth and May were bestowing gifts, rather than executing a plan they had worked out before Clara arrived. The stone cabin, Clara said, on the 4 acres. Something shifted in Doan's face. Not quite a smile, not quite the absence of one, the expression of a man recalculating a column of figures he thought he already knew. He repeated the words, slowly letting them settle. Then he told her what she already knew. Granite bedrock can't be plowed cabin, not worth tearing down. He said all of this carefully, like a man laying groundwork rather than offering information. Then he said there might be a buyer if she wanted to sell quietly, small commission for his trouble. She wouldn't even have to leave town to sign the papers. Clara looked at him. Really looked. The crow's feet at his eyes, the hands folded over the reins like a churchman's hands at Sunday service, the studied gentleness of his voice. She thought about her mother, mud to the elbows on a Sunday evening, washing her hands in the basin without apology, saying once on the back step in the August dark, look at what is actually there, not what someone tells you to see. No, Clara said. Doan's hands tightened on the reins. Just for a moment. So small and so fast that most people would have missed it entirely. Clara did not miss it. She filed it away in the same place she had filed the corner of paper beneath Ruth's thumb. He did not press her. He was not the kind of man who pressed. He was the kind of man who made an entry in his mental ledger and waited for the item to appreciate. She had just become an entry. She understood this without being able to name it fully, the way you understand weather before you understand meteorology in the body. First in the mind, later. She got the wagon before dawn the next morning, borrowed it from behind the store before Doan arrived, because she would not ask permission for what was already a matter of necessity. The ride north took 40 minutes along a rutted track that wound through birch forest and over granite ridges. The air warm, but carrying that faint metallic edge of a season already deciding to change. Crickets loud in the tall grass. A red-tailed hawk circling something she couldn't see from the road. The world so ordinary in its beauty that she had to keep reminding herself what she had buried yesterday. Then she came around the last bend, and there it was. It was exactly as bad as memory insisted. The fieldstone walls were thick and solidly built. Whoever had laid them had been skilled, had known what they were doing, had graduated the stones by size from the massive blocks at the base to the smaller ones near the roof line. But the mortar between the upper courses had crumbled in long sections, leaving gaps wide enough to admit windbird's winter. The plank door hung crooked on dried leather hinges. The cedar shake roof had lost a full third of its covering, and the holes left behind were big enough to fly through. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it without moving for a long moment. Then she walked forward and put her hand flat against the stone. The surface was warm from the morning sun, dense and solid, the work of someone who had cared enough to do it right. She walked the entire perimeter slowly, one hand trailing along the wall. Then she pushed open the crooked door and stepped inside. The smell reached her first damp earth-old wood, the particular mustiness of a space long closed. But underneath those smells, faint and almost gone, but unmistakably present, something else. Beeswax. Fresh-cut lumber. Slaked lime. Not old smells, recent ones. recent enough to still be present despite the summer heat. She stopped in the center of the room. The afternoon light was coming through the gaps in the roof and falling across the warped plank floor in long bars full of drifting dust. In one of those bars of light near the center of the room, she saw it. A boot print, dried mud pressed into the grain of the floorboard. A woman's boot, small, square-heeled. Clara crouched down beside it. She spread her hand on the floor next to the print, the same size as her mother's foot. She stayed crouched there, not moving. Something in her chest did two things at once, tightened and opened grief and discovery, pressing against each other in a space that wasn't quite large enough to hold them both. Eleanor Voss had been here, not years ago. Recently. The lime smell was recent. The beeswax was recent. The air coming up through the gaps between the floorboards was wrong. Not cold, not stale mild. Steady. The temperature of a root cellar in spring. A gentle warmth that had no business existing in an abandoned structure in August. Clara pressed her palm flat between two planks. Warm air breathed against her skin, slow and even, like something living. She found the iron pry bar in the corner where the disconnected stovepipe leaned against the wall. It was clean, recently oiled, placed in exactly the position a person would leave it if they expected to come back for it. Clara wedged it under the nearest floorboard, leaned into it, and pulled. The board lifted with a low groan, and the warm air poured up around her face like a held breath finally let go. She worked quickly after that, prying up board after board until the opening was large enough. Then she sat back on her heels and looked down into the dark. Not bare earth, a cellar, stone-walled at least 8 feet deep, maybe more. The walls built from the same field stone as the cabin above, but the work was different, tighter, more precise. The work of someone who had taken twice as long because they understood that what you build underground must outlast everything built above it. A wooden ladder leaned against the near wall, its rungs polished smooth by use. Clara found a candle stub on the windowsill and a tin of matches in the toolbox by the disconnected stove. She lit the candle and she climbed down. By the third rung, she had to take off her coat. By the fifth, her face was wet. She did not know when the crying had started. It was simply there, tears moving down her chin and dripping onto her collarbone, and she did not stop them because there was nothing in her that wanted to. Her foot touched the floor. Flat stones fitted tightly together. Months of careful work just on the floor alone. She lifted the candle and turned. Shelves. Wooden shelves built into the stone along the entire far wall floor. To ceiling, built with the same precision as everything else down here. On those shelves, rows of sealed glass jars caught the candlelight and held it glowing amber and green and the deep burgundy of preserved beets. Clara stepped forward and lifted one. Green beans, bright, impossible, vivid. Another tomatoes whole packed tight. Apple butter dark as mahogany. Pickled beets. Corn relish. Blackberry preserves so dark they were almost black. Every jar sealed with wax. Every jar labeled in a handwriting Clara had known her entire life. Small, precise, unhurried. The contents, the date. The oldest jars were dated April 1881, 5 years. Eleanor Voss had been coming to this worthless piece of granite 4 miles north of town for 5 years. 5 years of Sundays. 5 years of mud on her boots and lime under her fingernails, and a back that must have screamed by the end of every trip. 5 years of telling her daughters she was picking mushrooms. 5 years of this alone, while Clara swept floors for $1 a week, and May nodded along to everything Ruth said, and Ruth ran the family house like it was a country she had personally conquered. Clara counted the jars. 43. She stood in the candlelight with her palm flat against the warm stone wall, and she let herself break fully, once a single hard sob that used up everything she had. Then she wiped her face and kept looking. 3 sealed wooden barrels in the corner, wheat grain oats, dried beans, each pried open just far enough to confirm. Folded on a stone shelf, 4 wool blankets so thick they barely bent 2 sheepskin pelts with the wool still on. Beside them, a wooden box containing tools, a handsaw with a fresh filed edge, a draw knife, a brace, and bit, a paper-wrapped bundle of iron nails, a ball of hemp twine, a sharpening stone already worn to the right angle. Everything a person would need to repair a shelter. Everything a person would need to survive a winter they knew was coming. Then, in the lowest corner of the cellar, where the foundation stones met the natural bedrock, she found the reason for all of it. Water, seeping slowly from a crack in the granite, barely a trickle, pooling in a shallow basin, worn into the rock over centuries, then draining away through another fissure deeper down. Clara knelt and touched it. Warm. Not hot, not enough to steam, but warm with the steady, faithful warmth of something that had been warm since before anyone alive had a name for what it was. The stone around the basin was warm. The warmth radiated outward through the cellar walls, through the fitted floor, up through the gaps in the planks above. The earth itself was the heat source. Eleanor Voss had found a geothermal spring on a piece of land that everyone in Leelanau County had agreed was worthless, and she had spent 5 years building a shelter around it, by hand, stone by stone, without telling a living soul. Clara sat down on the floor, with her back against the warm wall, and stayed there until the candle was a third of what it had been. She found the notebook last exactly where someone who planned to be found would leave it wrapped in oilcloth beneath the sharpening stone at the very bottom of the toolbox. The leather cover was cracked from handling. The pages were soft. The first half was technical. A work journal from the beginning. April 1881, with entries recording every phase of construction in Eleanor's small, precise hand. Notes on mortar ratios, drainage angles, hand-drawn cross-sections of the foundation. But scattered through the technical entries appearing without warning were other lines, shorter, personal. My back has been bad for 4 days now. No one has asked why. Clara read that line twice and heard her mother's voice in it, exactly dry, observational. Just short of bitter. Ruth asked me again this week where I go on Sundays. I told her I was picking mushrooms. She accepted this immediately, which tells me more about what she thinks I'm capable of than anything she has ever said to my face. Clara laughed, a short, wet sound that surprised her. She turned to the last written page. The ink was heavier, the letters pressed harder into the paper, as though this had been written with intention rather than habit. Clara. I don't know which winter it will be, but I know it will come. I know what the signs look like, and this summer they are everywhere. When you find this, you'll know I was right. There is one more thing I've left you. East side of the property, beneath the largest oak tree. You'll know when you're ready. Mama. March 1886. 5 months before she died. Clara climbed back up the ladder with the notebook pressed against her ribs. The sky outside had turned the color of bruised peaches, the last of the evening light bleeding out through the birch canopy. She stood in the open doorway of the cabin and did not cry anymore. She was somewhere past crying in that flat, clear country, on the far side of grief, where everything looks very simple and very sharp at the same time. She did not go back to town. She rebuilt the fire in the rusted iron stove, connecting the pipe to the flue with twisted wire and a determination that had no patience for failure. She unrolled one of the wool blankets on the warped plank floor. She lay down with the candle burning low beside her head and the notebook against her chest, certain she would not sleep. She slept. The knock came sometime past midnight. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the plank door, the knock of someone who had walked a long distance and had no intention of leaving. Clara sat up in the dark, with her heart making itself known against her sternum. She found the iron pry bar in the blackness by feel alone. She crossed to the door. "Who's there?" A woman's voice came back through the wood, old steady, giving nothing away. "Agnes Holt. Your mamma said if she went first, I was to come find you." Clara did not move. She did not know anyone named Agnes Holt. But the voice on the other side of that door knew exactly who Clara was, had walked 4 miles through dark forest on a late summer night to reach her on the very first night she had spent in this place, and was speaking with the calm of someone who had expected to be making this trip for some time. Clara slid the bolt. She opened the door. The woman on the step was perhaps 70 years old, small, white-haired, wearing a heavy gray shawl, despite the August night. Her walking stick was worn smooth at the top from decades of the same thumb pressing the same spot. She looked at Clara the way a person looks at a thing they have been waiting to confirm with their own eyes. Then she nodded once with the finality of someone checking an item off a list they have been carrying for years. "You have her eyes," Agnes said. She came inside without being asked. Or perhaps Clara stepped back, and that amounted to the same thing. Agnes surveyed the room, slowly taking in the open trap door in the floor, the wool blanket, the burned-down candle, the notebook lying where Clara had set it down. None of it appeared to surprise her. She lowered herself onto the small stool near the cold stove with the care of a woman who has learned that joints are a resource to be managed. She laid her walking stick across her knees, and she said without ceremony, "She told me she was going to leave you a project. I helped carry lime up here in the summer of 1883. My back hasn't been the same since." Clara sat down on the floor across from her. She did not even feel her legs fold under her. They simply did it the way the body sometimes makes decisions ahead of the mind. She wasn't alone, Agnes said. 3 words, the floor of everything Clara thought she understood, shifted a full degree beneath her. Agnes watched her face absorb this. Then she said there had been others. There still were. Women who had known about each other for years, who passed information in ways that looked like nothing. A nod at the dry goods counter. A note tucked into a basket of eggs. A particular way of timing a visit that meant something was wrong and help was needed. Eleanor had not founded this network. She had become its center, the place where the threads came together, the mind that decided what to do when the decision mattered. Then Agnes told Clara what Eleanor had been watching. For 20 years, Eleanor had paid attention to the things most people in Leelanau County walked past without seeing. The growth rings on cedar stumps, the behavior of geese in August, the thickness of birch bark in late summer, the way squirrels worked the oak trees in years before hard winters, stripping them bare before September. This summer, the signs were stacked geese, moving south 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Squirrels working with an urgency that looked almost like fear. Cedar rings twice as thick as the previous year. A persistent metallic quality to the air that had no business being there in August. She believed a winter was coming, Agnes said, of a kind this part of Michigan hasn't seen in 50 years. Maybe longer. Clara felt the warm air still rising from the open trap door at her back. She thought about 43 jars on a shelf built for one person. She looked at Agnes. How many people is she expecting? Agnes didn't answer that directly. She stood, picked up her stick, and moved toward the door with the economy of a woman who had learned to conserve everything. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back. Her voice dropped not from fear, but with the precision of someone delivering information that must land exactly right. Your mother believed someone had been watching this property for the last several months. She didn't know who, but she was certain they knew about the cellar. She was certain they were waiting for her to die. Then Agnes walked out into the dark forest, and the night swallowed her. Clara sat alone with the iron pry bar across her knees and the warm air breathing up through the floor, and she did not move for a long time. Outside, the wind was picking up off the granite ridge to the north, moving through the birch trees with a sound like dry hands being rubbed together, pressing against the shutters with a persistence that was not quite impatience. The cabin said nothing back. It simply held. She reached for the notebook. She opened it to the back, to the blank pages Eleanor had left, and found the pencil tucked into the spine. On the first empty page, by the light of the last half-inch of candle, she wrote her first entry. August 5th, 1886. I don't know yet what you've asked of me, Mama. But I'm here. I'm listening. I won't run. She closed the notebook and blew out the candle. She did not yet know about the man in the dark suit who had watched her ride north from town that morning, tracking her from behind a stand of alders near the feed store until the wagon disappeared around the first bend in the road. She did not yet know about the folded letter beneath Ruth's hand. She did not yet know that 4 miles south, in the back room of the parsonage on Main Street, a man named Harlan Beckett had been keeping a list with Eleanor Voss's name on it for years, and that he had drawn a neat line through that name the morning of the funeral, and written a new one underneath it in clerk's handwriting so small and so careful it almost looked like printing. September came in at an angle, not with the sudden cold that announced itself with a slow, deliberate withdrawal of warmth, like a tide pulling back from a beach, so gradually that you only noticed the distance when you looked back at where you'd been standing. The birch leaves began turning at their tips in the second week. By the third week, they were falling into the clearing outside the cabin in twos and threes, spinning down through the still air like small spent flames. Samuel Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday morning. He was 60 years old, with the particular stillness of a man who had survived something that should have killed him and had never quite decided what to do with the survival. Heavy hands, a face weathered by decades of Michigan winters, the deliberate economy of movement that comes from years of working alone. He had known Eleanor. He stood in Claire's doorway with his hat in his hands and told her that Eleanor Voss was the most intelligent person he had ever shared a room with, and that the tragedy of her life was that no one else in those rooms had been paying enough attention to notice. He looked at the gaps in the upper stonework. He looked at the leather hinges. He looked at the rusted stovepipe. You'll need quicklime, he said, river sand, and a froe for the cedar. I don't know what a froe is. I know you don't. I'll teach you. He did. For 6 weeks, Samuel Pruitt came up the road and gave Clara an education in the logic of materials. He showed her how to identify limestone by the way it reacted to vinegar, the fizzing that meant the stone was alive with carbonate ready to be transformed. He showed her how to burn it through a long night fire until it became quicklime, then how to mix it with river sand and water into a mortar that would harden between the field stones and refuse to move. He taught her to read cedar, how to find the straight grain that split cleanly, how to avoid the twisted fiber that would break rather than yield. He showed her how a froe worked, how the mallet strike had to be decisive rather than tentative, how the wood split along its own nature if you let it. How, fighting the grain, cautious, huge fish, cheat for half fish. The result. By the end of the first day, her shoulders were on fire. Her palms bled through the flour sack she'd wrapped around her hands as a makeshift glove. But 40 new shakes were drying in the afternoon sun in a row, and the satisfaction of looking at them was something she had never felt pushing a broom across Doan's plank floor. On the seventh day, while they were fitting new stovepipe sections through the repaired section of roof, Samuel told her. He spoke the way men of that generation spoke about the things that had nearly erased them quietly, looking at his hands rather than at her, without drama or apology, the way you might recount a fact about geography. His wife, Sidoni, had died in the winter of 1878. Pneumonia, 2 weeks of it, every remedy exhausted. She died on a Tuesday morning while he was boiling water for tea she would never drink. He buried her himself in ground that was frozen solid 3 days of work. 2 broken shovels. Then he drank. Not socially the way a man drinks when dissolution seems like the only reasonable response to a world that has become unrecognizable. A month of it. The animals went unfed. He went unfed. The farm went silent, and he let it go, because silence was the only condition that didn't actively hurt. Then, one night in February, he took his rifle and walked north into the forest. No lantern, no coat, no destination, just the thing he had decided to do waiting for him somewhere in the dark between the trees. Your mother came down the trail, he said. He was still looking at his hands. Past midnight. 20 below. She was alone. She had no reason to be out there. She walked up to me, didn't ask what I was doing, didn't ask if I was all right. Just said, Samuel, come home. Tonight isn't your night. And I went home with her. Clara held the pipe section very still. How did she know you were out there? Samuel looked up at her then. His face had changed, not softened exactly, but become more legible, the way faces do when a person finally allows a thing to be seen. That, he said, is exactly what I want you to understand. She understood it later when Agnes came up the next morning with a basket of dried herbs, a small wheel of hard cheese, and a folded sheet of paper that she smoothed flat on the kitchen table. 12 names. Women. Eleanor had reached over 15 years. Each one, a different emergency, a different configuration of desperation. The widow of the cooper on Front Street. A washerwoman near the boat works who had disappeared from town for 3 months in 1882 and reappeared saying she had been visiting a sister, which was not true. The schoolteacher's daughter, who had moved to Detroit when Clara was 12. The departure had always seemed abrupt, the explanation thin. Agnes touched that name with one finger. Her husband used to put her in the root cellar for 2 days at a time when he was drunk. Eleanor got her out, bought her ticket to Detroit with money from selling preserves. One name near the bottom of the list made Clara press both palms flat against the table to keep her hand steady. The name was Margaret Pruitt. Agnes told the story in the same measured voice she used for everything, and what she told was this: on the same night in February that Samuel walked into the forest with his rifle, a woman named Margaret Pruitt, who lived a quarter mile from the Pruitt farm, was running across her own yard in bare feet, having heard her husband fire a shot into the kitchen wall. She found Samuel's boot prints in the snow. She followed them with her eyes to where they disappeared into the trees heading north. She knew what those tracks meant. She ran 2 miles in a nightgown to Eleanor's door, and Eleanor put on her boots in the dark and went into the woods alone while Agnes held Margaret's hand at the kitchen table and cleaned the cut at her hairline with cold water. There is a network, Clara, nearly 20 years of it, women who knew about each other. Eleanor was not the founder. She was the place where everything converged. She was the one who decided. The cellar, Clara said, is the next step. The thing she'd been planning for 10 years. A place that didn't depend on anyone's kitchen table. A place that couldn't be searched. A place a woman could reach in the worst weather, in the worst moment, and find a roof and warmth and food and someone at the bottom of the ladder waiting. Clara felt the tears come then and didn't stop them. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she tell any of us? Agnes's face changed in the small way that faces change when an answer is both true and insufficient. She was going to, this winter. The October rain arrived hard and purposeful, not with the gradual buildup that gives a person time to prepare, but with the sudden total commitment of something that has been planning this for weeks. Clara woke to the sound of it against the new cedar shakes and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. The roof held. That was the first thing she registered, the sound of rain against wood, rather than the sound of rain against her face. After 2 months of labor that had cost her blood from her palms and the full range of motion in her right shoulder, for 3 consecutive days, the roof held. Then she heard the other sound beneath it. Water moving where water had no path to go. She was through the trap door before she was fully awake, feet hitting the cellar floor in the dark, and the cold wetness that met her bare soles told her everything before the lantern did. The east seam, the junction between the fitted foundation wall and the natural bedrock that she had known was unfinished, that Eleanor had known was unfinished, the 6 hours of work that death had simply canceled, was weeping. Not catastrophically. A persistent, purposeful seep that had been moving for hours while Clara slept, spreading dark across the fitted stone floor in a slow fan that was now 8 feet wide. The jars were safe. The shelves cleared the water by 14 inches. She looked at them in the lantern light, Eleanor's 43 jars in their patient rows, and understood not for the first time that her mother had built failure into the design. Not because she expected to fail, but because she understood that anyone building anything alone over 5 years in secret would leave something unfinished, and she had arranged everything else to survive that incompleteness. Clara bailed for 14 hours. The first 4 were mechanical: fill the bucket, climb the ladder, empty it into the yard, descend, fill again. The next 4 required a conversation with her arms that they were not willing to have. By hour 10, she was working on something beyond physical capacity, operating on the kind of determination that burns cleaner than muscle. And by the time she sat down on the wet cellar floor at 2 a.m, with her back against the east wall, she had moved enough water to matter. The thought arrived the way unwanted thoughts always do, in the silence between one effort and the next, when the body is too tired to keep them out. May was right. This is just a pile of rocks. She let it sit there for 30 seconds. Then she looked at the jars. She stood up. She went to the creek in the rain without a coat. The blue clay ran deep along the east bank, the heavy cold kind that held its shape when compressed and dried slower than surface clay, which meant it held longer. She dug with her bare hands because a shovel would have been faster, but her hands could feel what the shovel could not. The texture changing from topsoil to true clay. The point where the material became what she actually needed. She carried it back in her apron load after load. She mixed it with cold ash from the stove. She packed it into the seam in layers, pressing each one until it resisted, before adding the next, working from the bottom of the crack, upward the way water would try to push from the outside in. The seep stopped at 4:15 in the morning. Clara climbed out of the cellar and sat on the cabin floor with her back against the wall, clay to her wrists, ash under her fingernails, and felt something settle in her chest that was not pride. Something quieter than pride, more durable. She had broken something real and fixed it with what the land itself provided. The cellar was not just repaired, it was more watertight than it had been before the rain came because now it had been tested. This was what Eleanor had understood from the beginning. You don't build a thing that survives by making it invulnerable. You build it by learning where it fails. The invoice from Cyrus Stone arrived 4 days later, slid under the store's front door by his clerk, which told Clara that Doane had calculated the odds of her coming to argue it in person and decided he preferred to avoid the encounter. The figure was $12 with interest compounded at a rate that required a particular kind of confidence to print on paper and call fair. She walked the 4 miles into town in cold air that smelled of ice, still a month away. She found Doane behind his counter in his habitual position. Sleeves rolled, ledger, open, the studied ease of a man who has arranged his environment to signal that he is never surprised. She waited until the last customer, a farmer buying lamp oil, had taken his change. Then she stated her terms. 8 hand-split cedar shakes from the timber on her own land. At honest market value for hand-split cedar, $1.50 apiece, the total was $12 exactly. Doane's response was patient, almost kind, the condescension of a man explaining arithmetic to someone who should already know it. $12 in milled cedar was 40 shakes. He was willing to take 40 milled shakes. Clara told him that milled cedar and hand-split cedar were not the same material, that every carpenter in Leelanau County knew the distinction, that the price differential was not her invention, but the market's, and that if he preferred to debate this in front of a judge in Lansing, she would retain a lawyer and spend a year on the case, rather than establish herself as someone he could compress whenever he required it. The ledger sat between them. Doane looked at her, really looked the way he had not looked since the day on the wagon when she refused to sell, and in his silence she could hear him revising something he had believed about her until 30 seconds ago. Tuesday, he said. She walked out. Half a block down the street, she stopped with her hand on the cold brick of the feed store wall and breathed through the shaking in her knees, because holding ground always costs something physical. Always left the body settling a debt the mind had agreed to without consulting it. The feeling underneath the shaking was the same one she'd had on the cellar floor. Not victory, the simpler, harder proof she had not moved. James Calloway rode out to the cabin in the 3rd week of October on a horse that moved carefully through the mud, picking its steps with a deliberateness that matched its rider. He was 21 years old. He had been 7 when his mother brought him to the cellar in 1872, and the 14 years since had built him into someone who carried his history quietly, the way certain kinds of timber carry their grain. He removed his hat before he knocked. Clara noticed that. She made coffee on the repaired stove. They sat across the kitchen table from each other in the October light, and he said he had come because he believed she was in trouble, and he believed she did not yet understand how much. Harlan Beckett, Reverend First Methodist Church, Main Street, Traverse City, had filed a petition with Judge Henderson in Lansing. The petition requested that the court declare Clara Voss incompetent to manage her inherited property. The grounds cited were what Beckett was calling demonstrated mental instability, living alone in the woods, refusing to attend services, abandoning steady employment, allegedly speaking to herself. The petition was supported by sworn affidavits from Ruth Voss Cyrus Doane and 2 members of Beckett's congregation who claimed to have observed Clara's behavior in public. Clara went very still in her chair. Under Michigan law in 1886, an unmarried woman of any age could be declared incompetent on the sworn testimony of 3 men of standing. The court would appoint a guardian, almost always male, almost always someone with existing connections to the property or the petitioner. That guardian would hold full legal control, the right to sell, lease, or transfer the property without the woman's consent. Clara would have no legal mechanism to object. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. The coffee was still hot between her palms, but she could not feel the heat anymore. Calloway looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes had gone to a different place. Not formal, not official. Something much older than that. His mother's name was Nora Calloway. Widowed before he could remember clearly why. His father had been a drinker, the kind who broke things first, and then broke people. In the winter of 1872, Eleanor Voss had put Nora and James in a wagon under a pile of quilts and driven them 4 miles north in the dark. They had lived in the cellar for 6 weeks. Eleanor had brought food twice a week. She had read to James Bible stories, then a book about a boy who ran away to sea. She had told Nora she could stay as long as necessary, and meant it. After 6 weeks, she had put them on a stage to Nora's sister in Cleveland. They had returned to Traverse City 3 years later after his father died of consumption. His mother was alive. She was 57 years old. She lived on the pension James sent her each month, and she thought about Eleanor Voss every single day. "I'm here," he said, "because Eleanor saved my mother's life. She saved mine. What is happening to you is not going to happen on my watch." He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and slid a folded document across the table. A copy of the petition. He was not supposed to have it. "Whatever you need from me. Whatever you ask." Clara looked at the paper without picking it up. Outside, the wind moved through the birch trees with that dry, papery sound that meant the leaves were almost gone. The sky through the window was the color of pewter. Again, the same color it had been the morning they buried Eleanor. And, for a moment, the month between those 2 points collapsed entirely. She picked up the paper. She read it through once steadily, the way you read something that is trying to frighten you all the way through, without stopping, because stopping is where fear gets its purchase. When she finished, she set it down again and looked at the name of the man who had signed it. And she understood something that had been hovering at the edge of her awareness since Agnes left that first night. Someone had been watching this cabin. Someone who knew about the cellar. Someone who was waiting for Eleanor Voss to die. That someone had a name now. That someone wore a collar on Sunday morning and spoke about grace and redemption from a pulpit on Main Street, and had been keeping a list with her mother's name on it, and had been waiting patiently, methodically, in the manner of a man who understood that patience was simply planning, extended over time for the moment when that name could be crossed out. She looked at Calloway. "How long?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. He didn't know, but he suspected it had been years. Clara folded the petition back along its original creases. She set it on the table. She looked out the window at the birch trees, at the cleared land where her mother had walked alone on 100 Sundays, pretending to look for mushrooms at the solid granite ridge to the north that cut the sky in a clean line. "Tell me everything you know about Reverend Harlan Beckett," she said. Outside, the wind picked up. It came down off the ridge, the way it always did this time of year, moving through the thinned canopy with a voice that was somewhere between a whisper and a warning, pressing against the new cedar shakes on the repaired roof with a testing pressure, checking for weakness, the way weather always does. The shakes held. The mortar held. The cabin, which everyone agreed was worthless, held everything inside it. Clara Voss sat at the table. Her mother had never sat at in the cabin. Her mother had built for someone else's survival, with a document in front of her that a man believed would end her. And she began very quietly to understand what her mother had left her that was more useful than 43 jars on a shelf. She had left her a blueprint, not for the cellar, for the fight that the seller had always been preparing her to have. 4 miles south, in the parsonage on Main Street, Harlan Beckett sat at his own desk with his own lamp burning and opened his leather-bound book to the page he had been maintaining for 4 years. He read the new name at the bottom of the list. He had written it the morning of the funeral in his neat, unhurried hand. He studied it for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh page, picked up his pen, and began writing the letter to Cyrus Doane that he had been composing in his head since August. The geese had already stopped flying south. They were simply gone, all of them, the sky empty of that particular sound and shape that meant there was still time before the real cold came. The squirrels were not coming out of their caches anymore. The silence in the forest north of town had become absolute in a way that had nothing to do with the season. Something was coming. Clara Voss could feel it in the air in her blood, in the warm breath that rose through the floorboards every morning, like a promise her mother had made before she knew she was making it. She did not know yet what form it would take when it arrived. She knew only that the cabin was more solid than it had been 60 days ago, that the cellar was sealed, that the shelves were full, and that she was still here, still in the place that everyone had agreed she would leave before the first snow. She had not left. She would not leave. That was the whole of it for now. It was enough. Agnes arrived the following morning with dried thyme and sage in a basket, a round of hard cheese wrapped in cloth and folded inside her shawl. A sheet of paper she spread flat on the kitchen table without preamble. The same 12 names. Agnes went through them one by one, not hurrying, letting each name carry its weight. Each story different in its details, identical in its architecture. A woman in a situation that the law did not recognize as an emergency, reaching a point where she could not stay. Finding that Eleanor Voss knew how to move a person from one place to another without leaving a visible trail. Then Agnes put her finger on a name near the bottom and said, Maribel Beckett. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges furniture. Agnes told it plainly. In 1882, Harlan Beckett had broken his wife's arm with a fireplace poker. Maribel had come to Eleanor's door in a blizzard. They had hidden her for 9 days in the storage room behind the McKinney barn, cold, close, barely adequate, but invisible. Maribel had insisted on going back. She had no family within reach, no money of her own, no destination she could name. Eleanor had let her return because a woman who has been told her entire life that she has nowhere else to go often cannot believe in the elsewhere until she has seen it herself. She must have told him, Agnes said. At some point she must have told him about the network, about Eleanor, about the cabin. He's known since 1882, Clara said. 4 years before your mother died. Clara stood up. She walked to the door, opened. It stepped into the cold air of the yard. The birch trees at the clearing's edge had lost most of their leaves now and stood stripped, their white bark almost luminous in the flat October light. She stood there until the cold reached her through her shirt. Then she went back inside. Why the cabin specifically, he can't know about the spring. Agnes's expression shifted. Samuel may know more about that. Samuel arrived that afternoon and told it without being asked. There was a man in Detroit. His name was Harmon Stroud, and he owned 3 breweries, the kind of commercial operation that required enormous quantities of cold storage through the summer months, underground spaces, with stable temperatures and sufficient volume to hold the year's production while the market moved. Most of the natural caves in the northern part of the state were already under contract. Stroud had been buying land across northern Michigan for 2 years. Not for anything you could see from the road, but for what was underneath it. A stone-walled cellar, built on granite bedrock, with a natural warm water seep that kept it from freezing in winter while maintaining the cool stability that mattered in summer. That kind of space was worth more to Harmon Stroud than the entire Voss family's combined property. And Doan had known this because Doan made it his business to know what things were worth before the people who owned them did. Beckett has been borrowing money for 3 years, Agnes said. Everyone knows it. Half the county holds his notes. I have wondered for a long time what a man borrows against when he has nothing to borrow against. He was borrowing against this, Clara said. Against a property he didn't own yet. The three of them sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind came off the ridge with the particular edge it had developed in the last 2 weeks. Not the gusty variable wind of autumn, but something more deliberate. Something that had made up its mind. Agnes reached into the interior of her shawl and withdrew a sealed envelope. She held it on the table between her hands for a moment before speaking. The night before she passed, Eleanor came to my house. She gave me this. She said if anything happened to her in the year following, I was to carry it personally to Lansing and put it in Judge Henderson's hands. I took it down the day after the funeral. I was on the first morning train. What's inside? I don't know. I didn't open it. But Eleanor told me it contained everything she had gathered on Beckett. Every name, every date, every action she had been able to document. Agnes set the envelope on the table. She'd been collecting it since 1883, from the day Maribel went back. Clara looked at the envelope. The wax seal was old, the wax slightly clouded the way old wax goes. She thought about her mother pressing that seal down with her thumb, and knowing she might not be the one who saw it opened. Eleanor had been fighting Harlan Beckett for 3 years, before Clara even knew his name. The week that followed had its own rhythm. Mornings of physical work, afternoons of quiet planning, evenings when the temperature dropped fast and the stove earned everything Clara had put into repairing it. She and Samuel finished repointing the upper courses of the north wall. She worked alone on the cellar shelving, adding a second row along the south wall that more than doubled the storage capacity. Calloway came twice more, each time with fresh information from the county courthouse. The petition was still pending. Henderson had not ruled. There was a procedural window, narrow, defined in which a counterfiling could be made. The key was documentary evidence, sworn testimony from people who knew Beckett's actual character. The women Eleanor helped, Clara said on his second visit. Where are they now? Calloway understood immediately. 3 were reachable, the schoolteacher's daughter in Detroit. The Cooper's widow still on Front Street, a woman named Margaret Pruitt, who had moved to Sutton's Bay. If they were willing to swear to what they knew about Beckett in writing, notarized, it would make the petition look like what it was. Getting 3 women to come forward against a reverend in 1886 is not a small thing, Clara said. No, it isn't. Ask them anyway. She went to see Ruth on the last Thursday of October, walking into town and entering the family house through the kitchen door without knocking. Ruth was at the table with a pile of mending. She looked up. Her face went through several changes very quickly. Clara did not open with the petition. She opened with the letter. You took something from the table the morning Mama died. I saw the corner of it under your hand. Ruth's face did what it never did. It faltered. Just for a moment, just enough to confirm what Clara had suspected for 3 months. May came downstairs during the silence that followed. She looked between them and seemed to understand the geography of the moment with an accuracy that surprised Clara. Show her Ruth. Ruth looked at May with the expression of someone watching a person they thought they knew completely do something entirely outside the established pattern. Then Ruth stood up, went to the front room, took the family Bible from the shelf, opened it, withdrew a folded piece of paper from between the pages. She put it in Clara's hand without looking at her. The letter was in Eleanor's handwriting, dated August 3rd, the night before she died. It was addressed to all 3 of them. Clara read it standing up because she did not trust her legs to hold her through it sitting down. Eleanor had written to each of them separately within the same letter. To Ruth, I know you have always believed I loved Clara more. I did not. I loved you in a way I never learned to express out loud because you were my first, and I was so young and so frightened, and everything I had went into keeping you alive. I never found a way back to telling you. I'm sorry for that. To May, you have spent your whole life as someone else's reflection. You are a person entirely your own. You always have been. To Clara, there's a cellar beneath the cabin. There's a notebook inside. The notebook will tell you the rest. There is one more thing waiting for you beneath the largest oak on the eastern boundary. Then, to all three of them together. Listen carefully. Reverend Harlan Beckett has been planning for several years to take the cabin land after I die. He needs it for a man named Stroud in Detroit. He has been gathering false witnesses against me. I have placed my evidence in the hands of Judge Marcus Henderson in Lansing. Do not trust Beckett. Do not trust Cyrus Doane. Do not let them have the cabin. Protect each other. Protect what I built. I have loved you all differently, but completely. Mama. Clara lowered the letter. Ruth was crying. Standing in her own kitchen with her hand still holding the shape of the mending she'd set down, tears moving down her face without any apparent effort to stop them. I read the part to me, then I burned the rest. Before you came home that morning. Before May came down for breakfast. You burned the warning. I burned it because I was angry. Because Mama had written about you in the cellar and the oak tree about you, Clara, as if you were the only one she had anything real to leave. I burned it because I wanted her to have been wrong about you. A pause. Then 3 weeks later, Beckett came to me with the affidavit and told me it was to get you medical attention, that you were in danger of harming yourself out there alone. You believed that. I wanted to believe it. Ruth's voice was the voice of someone who has had an argument with themselves for 2 months and lost. I wanted her to have been wrong to choose you. I wanted to be the one she'd been right about. May stood at the edge of the room, and Clara felt her sister's presence as something newly weighted, not the decorative agreement May had offered for 27 years, but actual attention, the kind that had decided to be present rather than adjacent. Clara set the letter on the table. She set paper, ink, the family pen beside it. You are going to write to Judge Marcus Henderson in Lansing today. You are going to retract your sworn statement. You are going to explain that Beckett misrepresented the petition's purpose. You are going to write down everything you know about him. Everything Mama ever said. Everything Doane ever asked you, every conversation that matters. Then you are going to sign it. Calloway will carry it to Lansing on the morning train. Ruth's hands were shaking when she picked up the pen. She did not say she was sorry again. She started writing, which was worth more. The counterfiling reached Henderson's desk on the 1st of November, carried by Calloway on the morning train, alongside 3 sworn statements from the women Eleanor had helped delivered by hand to Sutton's Bay to Front Street to Detroit. The schoolteacher's daughter had written 14 pages. The cooper's widow had written 6 lines, but the 6 lines were precise enough to account for a decade. Margaret Pruitt had come in person, sitting in Calloway's office for 2 hours, speaking in a steady voice about what she knew of Harlan Beckett's character. Henderson reviewed the counterfiling. He sent word that the petition was suspended pending further review. He also sent word through unofficial channels, through a note so brief it contained no direct statement, that the original document appeared to contain irregularities he intended to examine closely. Clara received this information on a cold afternoon and stood in the cabin yard for a long time after Calloway rode away looking at the sky. It was not the sky of victory. It was the sky of a moment that has shifted without fully resolving. She did not feel safe. She felt the opposite of safe, not frightened, but alert, in a way that used up more of her than fear would have. Alert the way an animal is alert when the weather changes before the change is visible. Agnes came up on a Thursday and stayed 2 nights bringing more supplies for the cellar. They worked together moving everything to higher shelves, reorganizing the stores to account for more people than one. How many? Clara asked. Agnes handed her a jar of apple butter to place on the upper shelf. Your mother never put a number on it. She said the cellar should hold what it could hold and the right number would arrive. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. You can plan for a specific number and be wrong. Or you can plan for capacity and be ready for whatever comes. November moved. The temperature dropped in steps, rather than all at once, each step lower than the one before. Samuel came up and taught her how to read the indicators she had been seeing without knowing how to read them. The pressure changes before a major storm, readable in the behavior of the creek. The sound the birch trees made in the ridge wind. When the cold was coming from the northwest, a drier sound, more persistent. The sound of air that had crossed 1,000 miles of nothing before it arrived here. She was learning not just to maintain what Eleanor had built, but to extend her mother's ability to read the world around this place. The cabin had been built on Eleanor's knowledge of the land. Claire was acquiring that knowledge now from Samuel, from Agnes, from the land itself, the way knowledge always transfers imperfectly across generations, losing some things in the translation and gaining others that the original source couldn't have anticipated. Callaway came on the last Friday of November with news from Lansing that the petition had been formally suspended pending investigation. He also came with something in his expression Clara had not seen there before, a particular quality of alertness that matched what she had been carrying in her own body for 3 weeks. Henderson is looking at the supporting documents. He believes the congregation affidavits were coached. He's also looking at the original petition language. There's a phrase that doesn't match his usual phrasing. He's comparing it to other documents from his office. Callaway set down his coffee. If the petition contains a forged signature, Clara, that's not a civil petition anymore. She looked at him across the table. Outside, the wind had shifted. She could hear it in the way the birch trees moved, that dry, deliberate sound Samuel had described, the sound of air from the northwest that had made up its mind. How long before the state marshals could act? If Henderson confirms the forgery, he could request a warrant within a week. But the marshals would need to reach Traverse City, and if the weather closes... He stopped. They both heard it at the same moment. Not a sound, but a change in the sound. The quality of the wind outside the window going from consistent to something else. Something that had found a frequency it intended to hold. Clara looked at the dark sky through the glass. She thought about the geese already gone. The squirrels finished and silent. The cedar growth rings twice as thick as last year's, which was the tree's way of armoring itself against something it could feel coming months before it arrived. Whatever is coming, she said, is coming before the marshals get here. Callaway did not argue with her. He was a careful man, but he was not a man who mistook caution for wisdom when the evidence was unambiguous. He said he would check on her in 3 days sooner if the weather held, and when he said it, they both understood that the word sooner was doing more work in that sentence than the word weather. After he left, Clara went down into the cellar one more time before dark. The mineral spring moved in its granite basin with the same faithful patience it had maintained through 5 years of Eleanor's construction, through 2 months of Clara's tenancy, through everything. It simply continued doing what it had been doing since before anyone had thought to build around it, offering its warmth freely, without condition, to whoever had the sense to come in from the cold. You don't build a thing that survives by making it invulnerable, Clara thought. You build it by knowing what it's for. She climbed back up. She fed the stove and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the last page she had written, and she added a new line below it. November 28th, 1886. The storm is coming. I believe it will arrive before the law does. I believe Beckett knows this too. The cellar is as ready as I can make it. Whatever comes next, it will come to this door, and I will be behind it. She closed the notebook. She blew out the lamp. She lay down in the dark on the wool blanket, listening to the wind grow outside, listening to it find the new cedar shakes on the roof, and press against them with the same testing pressure the October rain had applied to the east wall seam, looking for weakness, checking for the thing that might give way. The shakes held. The mortar held. The woman inside held, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. 4 miles south, Harlan Beckett was not sleeping. He was at his desk with a lamp and his leather-bound book, writing the names of 3 men he trusted to be cold enough and capable enough and quiet enough for what he had decided tonight was going to happen before the month was out. He was looking at the weather through his parsonage window with the calculation of a man who understood that a blizzard was not an obstacle. It was cover. The storm announced itself not with snow, but with silence. The kind of silence that arrives before catastrophic weather. The way a pulled tide exposes the sea floor before a wave, not an absence of sound, but a withdrawal of it. The forest going to 0 degrees of noise so abruptly that Clara sat up from the wool blanket before she was fully conscious of why. The stove was still warm. The candle had burned to nothing. Through the cabin's one window, the sky was the color of iron that has been heated past, glowing back to cold. Then the wind came down off the granite ridge. It arrived not as gusts, but as a single sustained force, as though the atmosphere above Michigan had simply decided to relocate southward all at once. The birch trees went from stillness to violent motion. In the space of a breath, their stripped branches snapping against each other with sounds like rifle shots. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first 20 minutes. Clara felt it in the way the stovepipe contracted, the metal ticking with small, sharp sounds as it adjusted to a cold. It had not expected this fast. She was building the fire back before she had made a conscious decision to do so, feeding it with the split cedar she had stacked inside, specifically for this possibility, because Eleanor had built the wood box indoors. For exactly this reason, outside access to fuel. In a true blizzard was a calculation you could not count on. By midnight, there were 3 feet of snow on the ground. By 2 in the morning, she could no longer see the fence post 8 feet from the door. By 3, the wind had found a frequency that the cabin's stone walls absorbed. Rather than deflected a low harmonic vibration, she felt in her back teeth, rather than heard with her ears, the voice of a storm that had been gathering momentum across 1,000 miles of frozen lake before it arrived at this particular piece of granite bedrock and decided this was where it would spend itself. She went down into the cellar at 3:15 and sat against the warm wall with the lantern turned low to save oil, listening to the mineral spring move in its basin. It was the steadiest sound in the world. It had no opinion about the weather. Clara found this not comforting in the conventional sense, but clarifying it reminded her that the warmth beneath her was not a resource she had created. She had simply been left the knowledge of where it was. She was still sitting there when she heard the pounding. It came through 5 feet of snow, through the cabin floor above her head, through the trap door she had left ajar. 3 hard strikes against the cabin door. Then 3 more, then a continuous, desperate hammering that had none of the measured patience of Agnes's midnight knock 4 months ago. This was the sound of someone who had used up everything they had to reach this door and was now communicating that fact with their fists. Clara was up the ladder before the thought fully formed. She crossed the cabin in the dark, found the bolt by touch, slid it back, pulled the door against the resistance of the drift that had built against it. Ruth stood on the step in a coat that was wrong for this weather. Her good wool coat, the one she wore to church, soaked through and heavy with ice crystals that had formed in the fibers during what must have been miles of exposure. She was holding May against her side with both arms, May's feet dragging a furrow in the snow behind them. May's face turned against Ruth's shoulder with the boneless looseness of someone whose body has stopped making decisions. May's lips were the color of ash. Ruth's face above the ruined coat was a landscape of exhaustion and something that had moved past fear into a territory without a clean name. Her eyes found Clara's, and what they communicated was not a question. It was a transfer, the most complete one Ruth had ever offered anyone in her 31 years, the unconditional handing over of everything she could not carry any further. Clara took May's other arm over her shoulder. Together, they got her across the threshold. Then past Ruth's shoulder, emerging from the wall of white behind them, came the sound of sleigh bells. Not the cheerful sound of Christmas. The deliberate sound of a heavy conveyance moving through deep snow with purpose, the bells an incidental product of the harness rather than an ornament. 2 horses materialized first from the blizzard, their breath coming in dense white columns that the wind immediately tore apart. Behind them, a wide sled, a driver standing at the reins. On the bench beside the driver, a figure in a dark coat, collar up hat, pulled low against the wind. Harlan Beckett. He stepped down from the sled before it fully stopped moving, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has arrived at a moment he has been rehearsing for years. 3 men sat on the runner behind him, hooded hunched against the cold. One of them with a rifle laid across his knees, with the casual placement of a tool rather than a threat. The horses were already foaming at the shoulder. They had come a long way through this weather. So had Beckett's certainty. He reached into his coat and produced a document, holding it with both hands against the wind that tried immediately to take it. The paper snapped at the edges. The ink was visible even from the doorway, the bold heading of an official filing a signature block at the bottom that Clara could not read from this distance, but understood from the shape of the moment. Court order. His voice carried through the storm with the projection of a man accustomed to filling rooms. Signed by Judge Henderson. You are declared incompetent to manage this property. You will vacate by sunrise. Clara stood in the open doorway with the warm air from the cellar rising at her back, heating the space between her shoulder blades, and she looked at Harlan Beckett in the storm. Behind her, Ruth had May on the floor. She could hear Agnes moving below, already down the ladder, already preparing. She could hear Samuel's voice, low and unhurried, telling May to stay with him. Something in Clara's chest went to a quality she had never felt before. Not calm. She was not calm. Not anger. Anger was too warm for what this was. It was the temperature of granite. The temperature of a wall that has been tested by weather and held. She did not look at the document. She looked at the man. My sister is not moving, she said. Beckett's expression was the expression of a man who has already cataloged this response as one of several expected reactions, all of which he is prepared for. Your sister requires medical attention that you are not equipped to provide. She requires a doctor. I have the authority to see that she receives one. There was no doctor on the sled. The sled could not carry 6 people. Clara did not say either of these things because saying them would have suggested she was engaged in a negotiation, which she was not. Come inside, Ruth. She said it without moving her eyes from Beckett. Ruth was already moving, already pulling May toward the open trap door the warm air boiling up from below, wrapping around them both. Samuel, help her. Beckett took a step forward. You are not in a position. You brought no doctor. Claire's voice came out level in a way that surprised even her, the way things sometimes emerge from under pressure, already shaped into their final form. Your sled carries 4 people at capacity. You came here tonight knowing my sister might die in the snow, because her dying here meant the deed transferred without a court date. Both of my sisters are in this building. That is very convenient for you. Something moved across Beckett's face. Not guilt, the thing that moves across the face of a man who has been accurately described rather than accused. He had not expected accuracy. He had expected fear or pleading or the collapse that extreme weather and extreme pressure usually produced in a woman who had been systematically isolated from legal recourse for 4 months. He reached back into his coat with his right hand. The pistol was not large. It did not need to be. The geometry of the situation did all the work a larger weapon would have done. Clara in the doorway, Beckett 8 feet away, 3 men on the runner who had not moved, but whose stillness had reorganized itself into something attentive. You will sign the deed transfer, Beckett said. His voice had changed. The rehearsed quality was gone. What was left was simpler and therefore more dangerous, the voice of a man who has run out of patience with the distance between his plan and the present moment. You will sign it, and I will get your sister to a doctor, and this ends tonight. Clara did not move back from the doorway. She thought about her mother walking north through 20 below darkness with no lantern and no coat to talk a man with a rifle back from the edge of a decision he would not have survived. She thought about Eleanor at 19, arriving in Leelanau County with a baby on her hip and a bruise she would not explain, and building an entire life out of the determination that the thing that had happened to her would not simply continue happening to other people while she watched. You don't win every fight, Clara understood. You hold the door until the help arrives, and the help arrives because someone prepared for this exact night, years before this night existed. My mother prayed for you, Clara said. Not loudly, not performing it, saying it the way you say a true thing to someone who needs to hear it before the moment closes. Every Sunday in your own pew, she prayed for you. After everything Maribel told her, after she knew what you were planning, she never stopped. Did you know that Beckett's pistol hand was not steady? The wind drove a sheet of ice crystals against the side of the cabin with a sound like thrown gravel. The horses shifted their breathing ragged from the cold and the distance they'd covered. The 3 men on the runner had stopped being still in the way that means waiting and become still in a different way. The stillness of men reassessing whether they understood the situation they had agreed to participate in. Then, from the south, from somewhere below the ridge, came the sound of bells again. Different bells. A different sled. Beckett heard it. His head turned. Out of the blizzard, moving faster than anything, had a right to move, in 5 feet of snow, came a second conveyance, 2 horses pushing hard up the grade, a driver standing because he had been standing since the flat ground below the ridge and intended to arrive that way. 4 men behind him in heavy coats. On the bench, James Calloway, hatless, his dark hair plastered against his forehead by the wind, his eyes already on Beckett before the sled had fully stopped. Calloway had left Traverse City at 1 a.m. He had known because 3 days earlier, he had received a report from a deputy that Beckett had hired 3 men for an unspecified errand because a man who borrowed against a property he didn't own yet was a man on a deteriorating timeline that when the storm peaked was when Beckett would move. He had prepared for this the way Eleanor had prepared for every winter she watched approach, not by predicting the exact form it would take, but by being ready for the range of what it might require. He stepped off the sled onto the snow, with the contained urgency of a man who has been moving fast for 2 hours and has trained himself to arrive without looking like it. His right hand was at his side, open, visible, communicating the specific message that he had not come here to escalate, but was entirely prepared to. Beckett. Just the name. The wind nearly took it, but Beckett was close enough to receive it. Stop where you are, Calloway. The pistol swung toward him. The hand holding it was visibly shaking now from cold, from the recognition that the geometry had changed from the particular internal disorder of a man watching a plan that has taken 4 years to construct begin to dissolve in real time. Calloway stopped. He raised both hands slightly open, the gesture of a man who is choosing de-escalation, not from weakness, but from the understanding that the fastest path to the outcome he wants does not run through a gunshot in a blizzard. Your court order was vacated 3 days ago, Calloway said, his voice steady in the way of a person who has decided what he is going to say before he arrived and is now simply delivering it. Judge Henderson vacated it himself, Harlan. He was interested to find his own signature on a document he didn't sign. The pistol shook harder. That's not possible. It's in the courthouse file in Lansing. I read it myself last week. The judge sends his regards. Calloway took one step forward, slow, deliberate, announcing itself. Eleanor built her case before she died Beckett. She sent Henderson 12 sworn affidavits in June. Women you've spent a decade pretending didn't exist, including Maribel. The word Maribel did something to Beckett's face that no other word in the preceding 2 minutes had done. It was not the flinch of a man caught in a lie. It was older than that, the specific contraction of a person hearing a name that contains the full weight of what they have spent years not thinking about. The pistol lowered by 3 inches without Beckett appearing to decide to lower it. She signed an affidavit, Calloway said. Notarized. Filed with the court. She told everything she knew. The pistol came down. Not dramatically, it simply lost the structural support of Beckett's conviction and followed gravity to the snow. It landed with a soft sound almost inaudible under the wind and lay there in the white. Calloway was on him in 4 steps. The iron cuffs went on with the efficiency of a man who had done this enough times that the action required no thought. Beckett did not resist. He stood with his hands behind his back and the snow driving against his face, and stared at the cabin doorway, at the warm yellow light pouring from it, at the woman standing in that light with an expression Clara had never seen on another person's face. Not defeat. The specific bewilderment of a man realizing for the first time that someone he had classified as negligible had been thinking at the same level he was the entire time without his ever noticing. He had been planning her ruin since 1882. She had been building his accountability since 1883. They had been working in parallel for 4 years, and he had simply never looked at the other column. The 3 men on Beckett's sled climbed down and put their hands up. One of them spoke with the particular quality of a man who has realized he misunderstood the nature of his employment. We didn't know, Deputy. He said it was a court order. He said the woman was unwell. Calloway told them to take the sled home. He told them that if he learned any one of them had touched anyone on this property tonight, he would know where to find them. They left within 90 seconds, the sled disappearing back into the white with a haste that confirmed they understood their position. Calloway's 4 men loaded Beckett onto their own sled. Beckett turned his head one final time. His eyes found Clara through the blowing snow, and she stepped off the threshold into the cold. Not toward him, but close enough that only he could hear what she said next. She prayed for you every Sunday, even after she knew. Even after she'd spent 2 years gathering evidence against you. She sat in your pew, and she prayed for you by name, because that is the kind of woman she was, and you used it against her the entire time. And she prayed for you anyway. She held his gaze. I don't know how to do what she did, but I intend to learn. One tear moved down Beckett's face. The temperature took it before it reached his jaw. Frozen mid cheek, suspended a small personal monument to a moment he would carry into a courtroom in Lansing the following spring. The sled moved. The storm closed behind it. That was the last time Leelanau County saw Harlan Beckett as a free man. Beckett was held in the county jail in Traverse City for 2 weeks while the roads were impassable. When the state marshals arrived from Lansing, they came with a warrant that listed forgery, conspiracy, and attempted seizure of property by fraud. The trial convened in April of 1887. The 12 affidavits Eleanor had sent to Henderson in June sat in the official record like a foundation that had been poured before the building above it was even designed. Beckett was sentenced to 12 years at the state prison in Jackson. He did not appeal. His attorney later told a colleague that Beckett had seemed from the moment the verdict was read to be somewhere else entirely, as though the court and its proceedings were a formality he was observing from a considerable distance. Maribel Beckett returned to Traverse City the following summer. That story would take its own telling. Cyrus Doane learned about the night's events at 7 in the morning from a delivery driver who had heard it from one of Beckett's 3 hired men. Doane spent 40 minutes in his back office, then emerged, went to the livery, hitched his fastest horse to a small cutter, and drove south on the Elk Rapids Road. He made 11 miles before the storm's last assault closed the road entirely, and the horse went chest deep in a drift that had built against a stand of alders during the night. Doane walked back. He arrived at his own store just before 4 in the morning, frostbitten at the fingers and ears, and spent a week recovering in his apartment above the stockroom. He recovered physically. He did not recover financially. He had borrowed against the cellar land. He had borrowed against the timber rights he expected to control. He had borrowed against a future in which Clara Voss had been moved out of the way by a court order that no longer existed in favor of a man who was now in irons. The bank in Traverse City foreclosed on the store before the April mud dried. By summer, Cyrus Doane was a clerk in a shop in Sheboygan, taking inventory for a man who had years ago applied for work at Doane's and been turned away. Doane never spoke Eleanor Voss's name again in any documented context. Some forms of consequence require no one to administer them. Inside the cabin, 6 people occupied a space built for one, and the space held them. Clara, Ruth, May, Agnes, Samuel Calloway. 6 people in a shelter that had been designed to accommodate exactly this kind of overflow. The mineral spring continued its work without reference to the number of people above it. The stove burned through the cedar Clara had stacked inside. Then, through the reserve pile Samuel had insisted she keep under the floor in a box built for this reason. The 43 jars came down from the shelves one at a time. Opened, shared their contents, distributed with the unhurried equity of people who understand that a resource carefully built can sustain a community if the community is willing to be careful in return. May came back on the second day. She woke under 3 blankets on the sheepskin pelt, in the warmest corner in the amber light of a lantern turned low, and looked up at the stone ceiling for a long time before she moved. Agnes was beside her with broth, lifting her head, tilting the tin cup, watching her drink, with the focused patience of someone who has brought people back from the cold before. May's lips had returned to their natural color. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her eyes, when they opened fully, were different from the eyes Clara remembered from every prior version of their shared life. Not softer, not harder, but present in a new way. The eyes of someone who had been somewhere very far away and had made a decision in the dark of that distance about what they were returning to. She decided we should walk to your cabin in a blizzard, May said. Her voice was rough at the edges, but carried its own wry weight. I followed her. Ruth, sitting against the far wall, looked at the floor. She's never been right about anything before, May continued. The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite a laugh, but the precursor to both. Turns out she just needed the right conditions. Clara sat beside her on the floor. She took her sister's hand. They stayed like that without speaking until May fell back into a light sleep, and her breathing evened out into the regular cadence of a body repairing itself. On the third night, Calloway told Ruth what he had told Clara about his mother, about the 6 weeks in 1872, about the boy he had been, who was read to from a book about a boy who ran away to sea, while the world above them was deciding whether to become survivable. Ruth listened without her habitual armor. She sat against the cold wall of the cellar with her knees drawn up and her hands still. And she listened with the complete attention of someone who understands that they are being given information specifically so they can revise something they have held incorrectly for too long. When he finished, Ruth said nothing for a while. Then, she never told us any of this. She didn't need you to know, Calloway said. She needed the people she helped to be safe. The knowing wasn't the point. Ruth looked at her hands. I spent 31 years believing she loved Clara more. A pause. It wasn't that. She loved us all. She just knew which one of us could finish what she started. The third night was also the night Agnes told Eleanor's story. She told it the way she always communicated essential things, not in a straight line, but in a spiral that kept returning to the center from different angles, each pass adding something the previous one had prepared you to receive. Eleanor had arrived in Leelanau County in 1855 at 19 years old, with Ruth on her hip and a bruise she would never explain. She had taken in laundry. She had built something from flour and stubbornness. She had married Oliver Voss in 1858. A quiet man, a good man, the kind of good that does not call attention to itself. She had never told him about the man who gave her that bruise. He had never asked. That had been their compact. When Oliver died in 1877, she was 41 and had 3 daughters and a grief she refused to let stop her. When the first woman came to her door in 1878, she opened it. She did not open it because she had a plan. She opened it because she recognized the look on that woman's face from 23 years of living with the memory of her own face in a mirror she no longer owned. The network grew the way honest things grow, not by design, but by necessity. One connection at a time, each one made because the alternative was to do nothing, which Eleanor had discovered in 1855 was not actually an option for her. The cellar was the conclusion of 20 years of that growth. The things she had built because she understood finally that a kitchen table could be searched, a good woman's reputation could be destroyed, a borrowed room could be taken away, but a warm wall below the frost line built on land. No one wanted known to. No one except the people who needed it was something else entirely. She could have kept it for herself, Agnes said. She was looking at Clara when she said it. The warm spring, the sealed walls, the 43 jars, she built enough for one person to live very comfortably through any winter Michigan could produce. She chose not to build for one person. From the first stone, she built for whoever would come. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th day. They heard it change before they could see it, the wind losing its sustained note and dropping into the exhausted intervals of something that has spent itself fully. By dawn, the sound through the boards above them was the sound of silence and silence after 9 days of that particular noise was so complete it pressed against the ears like sound itself. Calloway cut out through the chimney chase, first dropping onto snow that came to his collarbone. He began clearing with the flat-nosed shovel Samuel had stored inside, because Eleanor had understood that access to tools in extreme weather required the tools to be where the weather couldn't bury them. The world they emerged into was remade. Every familiar angle had been replaced with the smooth geometry of new snow, the clearing a single unbroken plane. The birch trees waded into unfamiliar shapes. The sky above the granite ridge so clean and so blue, it looked manufactured. Clara stood in the trench. Calloway had dug to the yard and turned her face up to the first direct sunlight she had seen in 9 days, and felt it against her closed eyelids as something close to physical weight. They spent 3 more days at the cabin while the roads cleared. They cooked. They dug out the woodpile. Samuel reset the section of stovepipe the wind had worked loose at the top joint. Agnes taught May to dry herbs on a string stretched between the 2 ceiling beams. Thyme first, then sage, the bundles hanging in the stove's warmth and filling the cabin with a smell that had nothing to do with emergency. Ruth learned to split wood. She was poor at it. She improved. On the 3rd afternoon, Clara watched her from the doorway. Hair loose, face red from cold, bringing the axe down on a piece of cedar with a decisiveness that had been arriving all week, and Ruth looked up and saw her watching. Something passed between them across the 20 feet of cleared snow. Not absolution. Something more practical than absolution, the mutual acknowledgement that they were going to have to learn each other all over again, that this was going to take time, that they were both willing. The state marshal arrived on snowshoes on the morning of the 4th day, moving up the ridge from the south with the unhurried efficiency of a man used to arriving after the difficult part is done. He collected the paperwork Calloway had prepared, confirmed the charges, informed them that Beckett was still in county custody, and left within the hour. On the 6th day after the storm, when the road had been broken enough to travel, Clara took a shovel and walked east through the snow toward the largest oak on the property's eastern boundary. The drift at the tree's base came to her hip. She dug for an hour. Agnes came out with a thermos of broth. Calloway took a second shovel without being asked, falling into the work beside her with the easy silence of a person who helps because the task needs doing, rather than because they expect acknowledgement. 2 feet down, her shovel hit something that rang. She cleared around it with her hands. An oilcloth bundle, wrapped twice in greased twine, the grease still pliable, even in the frozen ground, which meant Eleanor had chosen it, knowing what Michigan winters did to anything less. Clara lifted it out. They opened it on the kitchen table. All 6 of them gathered around the table Clara had bought with her first month's wages from selling cedar, the table that had become the center of a life she had been building without knowing she was building it. Inside the oilcloth, a tin box. Inside the tin box, 47 envelopes, each one sealed with a single drop of brown wax, each one carrying a name on its face in Eleanor's small, precise handwriting. 47 names. 47 lives. On top of the stack, one more letter, this one addressed to Clara alone. Clara's hands were not steady. She did not try to make them steady. She read it aloud. Eleanor had not left gold. She had not left silver. She had left work, 47 women she had known about. 47 women she had not reached in time. 47 letters she had written to each of them and never been able to send because she had run out of days before she ran out of women who needed to be found. Inside each envelope, a letter to that woman. Inside each letter, the same essential information. There was a place, there was warmth, there was food. There was someone at the bottom of the ladder waiting, and she was welcome, for as long as she needed to be welcome. The cellar is not yours, Eleanor had written. It was never meant to be yours alone. It was meant to be the place that answered when someone knocked. Someone has to be the woman at the bottom of the ladder, Clara. If you walk away, everything here is still yours, the land, the warmth, the stores. You owe me nothing. You owe these women nothing. They are not your debt. But they are not nobodies either. She did not finish reading the last sentence aloud. She did not need to. The room already knew it. Clara set the letter down. She looked at the people around the table. Agnes, with her hand flat on the wood, steady as she had always been. Samuel, with his eyes wet and his pipe sitting cold and forgotten between his fingers. Calloway, watching her with the quality of attention that she had come to recognize as his particular form of care, full present, making no demands on what it found. May, with her hands folded, her face clear, her eyes carrying something new that had arrived during 9 days underground and would not be leaving. Ruth, sitting straight, as she always sat, but different inside that straightness now, the posture no longer armor, but simply how she held herself when she was paying complete attention. Ruth was waiting to be told what to do. This was the most generous thing she had ever offered anyone. The voluntary suspension of her own authority, the willingness to follow where she had always led. Clara had never seen it on her sister's face before, and understood looking at it now how much it cost her. Clara picked up the top envelope. She turned it over. The name on the front was written in Eleanor's careful hand, Eliza Marshall. She held it for a moment. The paper was light. Almost nothing, a few sheets, a wax seal, a name. The weight of it was entirely elsewhere. "We should start with this one," she said. That spring, the spring of 1887, the world reorganized itself around the decisions that had been made inside a blizzard. Ruth sold the family house in Traverse City. The house she had inherited clung to run with the precision of someone who confused control with safety. She used the proceeds to purchase 20 additional acres bordering the cabin's northern edge, not for herself alone, but for the thing the cabin was becoming. She built her own structure a quarter-mile up the ridge, 2 rooms, a good chimney, a door that faced south toward the clearing below. She came down to the cabin every morning, for coffee, stayed most of the day, returned at dusk. This became, without being named, the shape of her life. May stayed in the cabin through the spring and into the summer, taking the small room that Clara had partitioned from the main floor with a salvaged door and a curtain. She started a sewing circle in the front room on Tuesday afternoons, 3 women the first week, 7 by the end of the month, 11 by July. Widows, mostly, some of them not. They made quilts from salvaged fabric shirts, from remnant cloth small dresses for children whose mothers had no time for sewing because they were spending all their time surviving. May, by the time the leaves turned again, was a person Clara had never fully met before. A person with opinions she expressed without checking whether Ruth approved of them first. A person who could look at a situation and say what she actually thought, which turned out to be quite a lot. Agnes moved her things from her house in town to the cabin in late April. She said she had been alone for 15 years and had decided she was finished with it. Clara cried when she said this, and Agnes acted as though she hadn't noticed, which was its own form of grace. Samuel came up most days teaching Clara to read The Land in the Systematic Way. Eleanor had read it, not just the warm spring beneath the cabin, but the possibilities elsewhere. The places where the geology suggested other seeps, other thermal signatures. He believed there were others. The land believed so too, if you knew how to ask. Calloway was sworn in as full sheriff of Leelanau County in May of 1887. He came to the cabin every week officially to deliver mail. The cabin had acquired enough regular correspondence by spring that this was a legitimate function. Unofficially, he came to sit on the back step with Clara when the light allowed it, watching the sun move behind the birch trees on the ridge's western face, not saying much, not needing to. He was a patient man, the kind of patient that is not passivity, but strategy, waiting until the shape of a thing was clear before reaching for it. Clara watched him wait. She was not indifferent to the waiting. She simply had work to do first. There would be time. She could feel it in the same way she had begun to feel weather, as a quality of the air, a temperature that was not yet arrived but was oriented towards her. On a Tuesday morning in the third week of April, a woman appeared at the end of the road that led to the cabin. She came on foot, moving slowly because she was carrying something, not a bundle, not a bag, but three children who had reached the limit of their own walking and had redistributed themselves between her arms and her back and her hand in the unspoken negotiation of a family that has been in motion for a long time. The oldest child was perhaps 7. The woman had the posture of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of will rather than circumstance for considerably longer than their body would have chosen. She had a bruise under her left eye. 3 days old by the coloration, she had walked 26 miles in April mud to reach a door she had been told might open for her. Clara met her on the porch. The woman did not speak. She extended her right hand, in which she held an envelope. Its face, carrying a name in handwriting Clara would have recognized in the dark. The wax seal was intact. It had been intact for 2 years. The woman had been carrying it through one bad winter, and the worst winter, and a marriage that had become last week something she could no longer survive and still be herself. Clara opened the letter. Eleanor's voice came off the page in the familiar, small, precise characters, as clear and present as though no time had passed, as though the hand that wrote it were still attached to the woman who had pressed so hard she left impressions 3 pages deep. Eliza, if you have come to this door, you are welcome. Bring your children. Bring whatever you brought. The cabin is warm and there is food, and you do not have to explain yourself to anyone. You can stay 1 night. You can stay 1 year. You owe me nothing at all. Eleanor Voss. Clara folded the letter back into the envelope. She looked at Eliza Marshall standing on her porch in the April mud with 3 children arranged around her and a bruise that was moving through its colors toward yellow. She looked at the woman's face, not at the bruise at the face beneath it. The person inside the damage intact. She held the door open. She said, "Come in. Come." That evening, after Eliza's children were asleep on the sheepskin pelts in the cellar's warmest corner, 3 small bodies in a space that had been built years before. They existed by a woman who understood that the future always contains people you haven't met yet. Clara sat on the back step of the cabin in the last of the April light. She opened Eleanor's notebook to the next blank page. April 20th, 1887. The 8th woman from your list came today. Her name is Eliza. She has 3 children and a bruise 3 days old, and she carried your letter for 2 years through everything that 2 years can contain before she used it. She walked 26 miles in mud to deliver it to herself. I think that is the bravest thing I've ever seen. Mama, I understand now what you built. Not the walls and the shelves and the spring. Those I understood when I found them. I mean the other thing. The thing underneath the construction. You didn't build this place to protect yourself from the world. You built it because you believed with everything in you that when someone came to the door needing it more than you did, someone would be here to open it. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. To be present when she arrives. To be the woman at the bottom of the ladder. To hold the door open not because you know who is coming, but because you have decided in advance of knowing that whoever comes will be welcome. I am here. I will be here for all 47. I will be here for whoever comes after the 47. I learned this from you, your daughter Clara. She closed the notebook. The light had gone soft and horizontal, the particular quality of late April light in northern Michigan that carries the last hour of warmth in a color somewhere between amber and gold. Slanting through the birch trees at the clearing's western edge, and catching the new leaves, just opening still small, the tender light green of things that have decided to try the world again. A doe stepped from the tree line with a fawn behind her, the fawn still spotted, still at the age of not yet knowing which places required caution. They stopped at the clearing's edge. They looked at Clara. Clara looked back still, her hands flat on her thighs, giving them nothing to fear. The doe dropped her head. The fawn followed. Together they crossed the clearing at an unhurried walk, through the long April grass, through the warm air coming from the open cabin door behind Clara, through everything Eleanor had built and Clara had finished, and disappeared into the birch trees on the far side, as though they had done this 1,000 times before and intended to do it 1,000 times again. Inside the cabin, Agnes was laughing at something May had said, the real laugh, the one that arrived without warning and didn't care who heard it. Eliza's children were already asleep. Samuel's footsteps crossed the new oak floorboards with the even weight of a man who has found the place where he is supposed to be. Ruth's chimney sent a thin line of smoke from the ridge above, visible against the last of the light present, steady doing its work without asking to be noticed. Clara sat on the back step of the cabin. Her mother had built for all of this on the land everyone had agreed was worthless above the warm spring that the earth had been offering freely since before anyone thought to receive it. The notebook was in her hands. The 47 envelopes were inside on the table. The door behind her was open, and the light that came through it was the color of something that has been waiting a long time to be used. The world was warm. The door was open. Someone would come, and someone would be here. That was the whole thing Eleanor had known and spent 20 years building the proof of stone by stone in the dark, alone without asking anyone to watch. The birch trees moved in the evening air. The spring moved in its basin. Clara Voss stayed on the step until the light was gone, and then she went inside.